Hello and welcome to Goldfield Library's very first live streamed event. Because this is our very first for 2020, we may hit a few hiccups, so apologies in advance, just bear with us, we'll try and fix what we can as we go. Now, while I have your attention, I'd like to recommend that you check out our website, and I'll pop that up there. There it is. Check out our website. We've got lots of stuff happening online, even if you can't access the library physically. There's movie streaming, and we've made some kids craft videos. There's the ebooks and audiobooks and stuff like that, of course. And you should definitely check out your local library's social media. There's all sorts of great stuff happening on there, including some different ways to connect with librarians who will help you with some research questions or just the normal sorts of questions that you might have that normally you talk to a librarian about but can't. So we're trying to be available for all that sort of stuff. Now, before I begin officially, I'd also like to acknowledge that we are, both Robyn and I, currently on Judgerung land, and pay my respects to any elders currently watching. And of course, I'd love to introduce, on that side, Robyn Annear. So Robyn is an historian. She's a writer, a podcaster. She's written books on social history and local history and all sorts of great stuff, including a great one that I recommend often in the library, Bear Brass, which is all about the history of Melbourne. But the one we're here to talk about today is Nothing New, the history of secondhand. I'd also like to remind you that all of Robyn's books are available from your local booksellers, who are mostly taking online orders. And if you have any questions, please add them to which side am I on? The chat box on the side, and we will try and answer them towards the end. And the next very most important thing I need to do is say thank you very much for being here, Robyn, and I will hand over to you.
Stuart, the one thing you didn't do was introduce yourself. This is
oh my
Stuart
goodness,
Windsor.
I didn't.
Stuart Windsor, acting manager of programming at Goldfield Libraries and usually based at Castlemaine Library.
Thank you
Stuart.
for that very great introduction. Thanks, Robyn. I did mean to do that. I even meant to wear my tag and I forgot to do that.
I think we were going to say wear a tie. I was going to say that is never going to happen.
No, ties are not my thing.
Well, thanks for that introduction.
Yes. Thank you, Robyn.
Okay. Hey, welcome. This is the first time I've done this kind of thing, so I know you're going to bear with me. One of the weirdest things I have found about this is the eyes. My eyes will keep moving to my papers, and you'll be very aware of that. At least I am. Robyn Annear is my name, and as Stuart has said, here's my book, Nothing New, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. I've got some nothing new things all around me back here. This is my, I don't know what you call this, my kind of bunker, my podcasting studio, or otherwise my wardrobe, really. This is where all my gear is kept. Nothing New, a history of secondhand is what I'm going to be talking about. This book was published last year, and I started writing it a couple of years before that. And needless to say, it grew out of my own passion for all things secondhand. Ever since I can remember, op shops have been a haunt of mine, and they've been very instrumental in shaping my identity, I guess, ever since I was a teenager. So I'm ever so grateful to them. And they're full of surprises and treasures and unmediated or uncurated experiences, such as are difficult to find in this highly curated world that we live in. And needless to say, and this is a pathetic plaint, but I am missing, of all the things that I'm missing at the moment, op shops would rate very highly, because that sense of you never know what you might find is missing from my life at the moment. So I'm super glad to have this opportunity to talk about Nothing New and all things secondhand. Now I'm going to share with you some photos that would have made it into the book had it been an illustrated book. It's not, it's all words, but they're great words. I say so with the greatest modesty. I'm going to share some pictures with you. So you've seen the illustrated Nothing New. Let's see what I can produce for you. Let's try this. I have a picture here. I have some pictures here to begin with that appeared in Henry Mayhew's 2-volume work, The London Labour and the London Poor, published in the mid-19th century. And the mid-19th century was the heyday of secondhand, I'd have to say. It was up until then, there'd been very little question about whether you would wear secondhand or new. For most people, and I'm talking about clothes, but really whether you would use secondhand or new. For most people, there was not much choice. It was secondhand or nothing. And secondhand wasn't even considered secondhand. It wasn't an alternative. It was new to you. And so therefore it was new. Here was a secondhand dealer in London, of which there were hundreds, if not thousands. As I say, the 1850s was the absolute apex of the secondhand industry in London. It had grown hugely, like 100-fold in the first 50 years of the 19th century, largely with the influx of Jewish refugees and emigres from Europe, because tailoring and clothes generally and the selling of secondhand was very much a trade that they were accustomed to in the lands they'd come from, and they brought that expertise to London with them. I say London, the same was true of Paris and cities in the US and elsewhere in Europe and the world. But this was a photo in London of a female secondhand dealer, and you can see her clothes there. They're mostly cotton. There may be some wool there, but you wouldn't. These clothes, actually, these are uncommon as far as what has survived, and there was a good reason for that, as we'll find out as I go through. A lot of what you would see hanging up in a secondhand dealer's was silk, and that is what has tended to survive. So it's skewed our view of what people wore in earlier times, because everything else could be recycled, but silk could not. Silk was an end product in itself, pretty much. So let's move on through. I see she's got a budgie up there. I think it's a budgie, unless it's a rat. Let's move on. Hang on, I have to click here. Here's, as I mentioned, the secondhand industry is pretty much the province of Jewish people. And here is what was labelled in Mayhew as the Jew old clothes man. Old clo was what he would cry as he went through the streets. And he wasn't selling old clothes, he was collecting them. He'd be going through the streets or knocking on doors, and people would be either selling their old clothes to him, their unwanted clothes, or exchanging them in some cases. If he were a different old clothes man, he'd be carrying a whole lot of brand new china with him, for instance, and he would be offering china ornaments or tea sets or parts thereof in exchange for people's old clothes. And of course, for women who had only the housekeeping money, meagre housekeeping money that they were allowed by their husbands, they had no spending money to buy things that they would like. And so this was one way that they could get hold of consumable items, of decorations and ornaments, which we know people love to have all over every surface in the 19th century. So people like this guy or his crockery vending, crockery exchanging brethren would supply these things to people for the exchange of some clothes. And sometimes, the rumour went at least, sometimes women would be inclined to exchange their husband's second best suit of clothes for a dinner set or something. And we hear stories of husbands, irate husbands, chasing the old clothes men and the china vendors down the street to reclaim their clothes, which their wives had given away without permission in exchange for something they wanted. You can see he's got a hat in his other hand as well as on his head. And by the end of the day, they said that you would have a pile of hats several feet high, as well as many bags hanging around you. This guy was early in his day's clothing collection. And here we have the other end, the selling thereof. So here was Rosemary Lane and Petticoat Lane, two of the chief outlets, marketplaces for secondhand stuff. They basically flowed into one another, these two street markets. And they weren't just in Petticoat Lane and Rosemary Lane, but in all the streets and tributaries that fed into them. And one guy is selling boots and his wife is selling boots and shoes. The other is selling stuff that would be more classified as old iron, tools and all sorts of things like that. But the shoes were terrific and boots were terrifically lucrative, because people generally could not, they might be able to do without all sorts of clothes, they could not do, and their kids couldn't do without shoes and boots. And so these things would be tidied up and gussied up in all sorts of ways, fairly deceptive ways often, to look like almost as good as new, at least like they still had plenty of wear in them. They'd have perhaps cardboard covering the soles, and then they'd have a coating of what looked like dirt from the street over that, adhered in some way. So it looked like they'd just been warmed. In fact, they had holes going right through the soles, which with the first shower of rain, if not before, you would discover. Here we have the bone grubber and the London dustman, and the London dustman is crying, dust ho, or dust hoy, I see. These guys and others like them, collecting every kind of thing you can imagine, feed into the narrative that forms the part of my book, which is that at this period, there was no such thing as waste. And of course, that's still true in some parts of the world where we see footage and photos of people collecting stuff from garbage dumps and so on. And that was just the normal thing. That was how this went. This bone grubber would go around collecting bones and similar stuff from people's houses. It would be ground up and used for various purposes in the making of other things. And the London dustman, well, he collected everything that didn't have another name other than dust. And it was cinders and coals and stuff left behind from the fire, whether the heating fire or the cooking fire, or dust from the floors, or dust swept up from the yards, or any other kind of stuff that wasn't classed as paper or iron or bones or any of these other things that could be recycled. And the dustman would take it to the dust yard. Now you can see there's like a small hillock behind them here with a cart at the top and all sorts of pigs and things grubbing around in it. Somebody separated out some bones in the foreground, and we have women and children working hard here at shoveling and sieving and sifting this stuff. So basically they would find more bones and they'd find coal and cinders, which could be used in making bricks and building materials of different sorts, and all sorts of stuff which could be sent away and sold for manure, for growing broccoli and hops and all kinds of stuff. And they all had these specialised stuff. So the stuff that came from people's floors, kitchens and fireplaces could be recycled here from the dust yard. I was reading just last night about this thing that used to be called the Great Dust Heap of King's Cross. So before there was King's Cross Station in London, there was not just a hillock like this, but a mountain of dust, which apparently had been accumulating there since the Great Fire of London in 1666. And I've seen a painting of it, no photo, but a painting from 1836 showing this, surrounded by some fields and some buildings, some sort of TB asylum and places like this. So it was sort of on the outer, and this huge grey hillock, which had people working in the foreground like this, sifting, and fires and things going on around it. And Charles Dickens' novel, Our Mutual Friend, was set on the great dust heap of King's Cross. And the thing was that, I don't know, the date is a bit rubbery, but sometime post 1836, when this painting was made, the great dust heap of King's Cross was, the land that it was on was sold, and King's Cross Station was eventually built on it, and the dust was heaved up and loaded into ships as ballast, presumably, and sold for £40,000 to Russia to aid in the rebuilding of Moscow, which had been burned to the ground pretty much around the time of the invasion of the French, around 1812. So the rebuilding was going on big time, and to make those bricks and so on, this dust was very useful. Plus, it wasn't wanted in London, so who knew? That's the first part of my presentation. Let me take you to the next. Hold tight, folks. Oh, this is so confusing, but I'm getting there. The next part of my PowerPoint is something completely different. Another part of my book deals with lost property. And I came across these brilliant, these brilliant illustrations. I'm going to go back to the beginning. These brilliant illustrations. Nope, that's not what I want. Sorry, folks. These brilliant illustrations. No, these brilliant illustrations from Here we go. These brilliant illustrations from an article in the Strand magazine, the London Strand magazine from 1895. This was the same magazine. I don't know if you can see these, guys. Can you see these? No, you can't. Let me see if I can share them with you. Try this. No? I don't know if you're getting these, Stuart.
Not yet. Sorry, Robyn.
Okay, I'm going to try again. Something funny is happening with this one because it's not acting the way it should. Okay, just hold tight, everybody. Have a brief interval while I reactivate this one. I'm going to get it going. I know I can.
We did warn people there were going to be some hiccups on this one.
Yeah,
So
guys,
fine.
you are the guinea pigs. I mean, so am I. So is Stuart, but we're in this together. So be reassured. Yes, I'm going to do that. And now I'm going to go. Let's see if we can share this with you. Oh, there I am. Share screen. Let's go.
I'll hide myself again. There we are.
How's that? Can you see what I've got here?
That's the stuff. There we go. Thanks, Robyn.
Yeah, okay, let's try this. So from the Strand magazine, it was the same magazine that published Sherlock Holmes around the same period, Sherlock Holmes stories, had this fantastic illustrated essay of the lost property officers of London. This is of the railway station lost property as well as the Scotland Yard. So here we are at a corner of the LPO, which was the acronym for, or the abbreviation of the Lost Property Office at Euston Station in London. And look at this, we can see what looks like Lord Nelson's hat. I think there are sewing machines and there are, I don't know, all sorts of brown paper wrapped parcels, a high chair and, I don't know, mysterious machines and furniture and a bicycle in the background. But in the foreground, we can see umbrellas. And this is I can see a shovel too. This is a recurring theme in the lost property offices of anywhere, not just London, but we read about them in Melbourne, in Perth, in Brisbane, anywhere where there was public transport in particular. Here's a curious collection at Derby, the Midland Railway Company's lost property office. We've got a lawnmower, bicycles, a euphonium or something similar, and some croquet set and some buckets and what have you. And here we have the discovery at the finding of the baby Willie Euston at the Northwestern terminus. So that was Euston Station. This was a reenactment, I believe, of the finding of a baby in a chest. This was not a common occurrence, but it was not unheard of, but it was unusual for the baby to be found as Willie Euston was alive. Apparently he was sent to a workhouse, which I believe, and I don't know what became of poor Willie Euston, but at least he did survive his stranding in the Lost Property Office. These are some articles just brought into the Scotland Yard Lost Property Office. And this is where things would end up when they had been lost in London cabs or just anywhere else around the streets of London. Some of the most common things were binoculars and opera glasses and ladies' muffs and all sorts of things you might have on an evening out. It looks like there are a few Bibles and things there too. And needless to say, it was a very ship-shape operation, being Scotland Yard. But even so, the retrieval rate or the claiming rate of these things was fairly low. And the reason this features in my book on secondhand is that the stranding of these items at lost property offices would result in huge lost property sales once a year or more often, which would make really a pittance for the railway companies or for the government, but were great events on the calendar of their respective cities. And the newspapers loved them because all sorts of characters came out of the woodwork in order to bid at these lost property auctions. Here's one of the umbrella racks at the Euston Lost Property Office. Now, some of those are umbrellas and some are walking sticks, but there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of those lost and sold at any lost property auction. They'd be usually sold in bundles of either 6 or a dozen for not much money and would be bought en masse by street traders who would sell them back, possibly to the same people who lost them on the next rainy day. They'd be selling them from street corners all through London or whatever city they happen to be sold and lost in. And here's another thing, the gloves. And usually they were single gloves that were lost. I'd suggest mostly right-handed gloves because people would take them off to look at their watch or to fumble with their keys or their money. So single gloves lost, and here is just a week's collection of gloves at the Liverpool Street Station Lost Property Office. They'd be bundled up in sacks like this, and if you came looking for your missing glove, they'd be spilled out on the desk for you to rummage through. And then at the lost property auction, they'd be sold by the sack like this for next to nothing, and the buyer would usually dye the whole lot and try and pair them up as best they could. As I say, I suspect there were many right-handed gloves going begging, and then they'd sell them on the streets for almost nothing to a population that still wore gloves a great deal. This was a less common thing in the colonies. In Australia, for instance, at the Spencer Street Station sales, there were relatively few gloves. And this wasn't just because Australia was a warmer climate, but we just weren't such glove wearers, which was something that newcomers who chafed at the formality of the mother country used to often remark upon and loved about the colonies. Here is a sale at the Spencer Street Lost Property Office in the early 20th century, I think. This was a long, as you can see, a long shed with an arched roof that stood right where the Age building is now, at the corner of Collins and Spencer Streets, next to the big railway, grand-looking railway offices. There was nothing grand about this. It was a very shabby sort of place, and as you can see, on a sale day, it was packed. People would show up to bid for the strangest things, not just things that you would think would be worth money, but in fact, some of the most popular things were luggage, bags and cases, and swags as well, swags in particular. In the 1880s, 90s, and into the 20th century, they were hugely in demand because they would be sold and advertised as contents unknown. And this was a great draw card because those contents could be, of course, jewels or deeds to great properties on the other side of the globe, or money, of course. They rarely were. Usually it was someone's dirty undies, or as they said, in a typical swag, you'd have a bit of tobacco and somebody's sewing kit or a few needles stuck into a cork, and that was pretty much it. But the rumours used to run thick that someone sometime had found a fortune in one of these things. And so, just as today, the rumour mill fed these railway lost property sales. And like I say, the newspapers in particular love them. And it's great fun reading the newspaper accounts of not just the things bid on, but of the bidders themselves and their behaviour. Like I say, you didn't know what was in this luggage. And not only that, you weren't allowed to claim what you had bought until the whole sale was over. And the sale was often 700 or more lots. So people might bid at lot 100 and something on a promising looking valise. And they'd be watching the old guy who carried it out from the racks to see how he staggered under its weight and what gold bullion might be inside. But they had to wait until the entire sale was over to have a look inside. That's the second part. Now I'm going to do this and hope that my I say final, it might not be final. The next part, I move on from lost property sales. This looks promising. I move on from lost property sales to opportunity shops. And this, of course, was my question when I first started researching this book. Where was the first opportunity shop? You may be aware that opportunity shop is our term for charitable secondhand shops here in Australia and also in New Zealand. But elsewhere in the UK, they're charity shops. In America, they're thrift shops. And I think our term, opportunity shop, is far preferable. It doesn't have that tinge of morality and of judgment about it. It offers what I find in opportunity shops, the sense of possibility that might raise you up, and you never know what you might find. So it's a brilliant term, and I wanted to find out where it came from. I think I've missed a slide here, so I'm going to take us back one. one. No, I'm not. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, let's go back. Bear with me. You're getting a sneak preview. Oh, it's doing that same thing the other one did. How curious. All right, folks. I'm going to relaunch that one. So bear with me again because I want to see it right from the beginning. I want you to see it right from the beginning because it's worth it. It's somebody I want to point out to you. Let's see. Let's see if we can find her. Doesn't want to show her to me. Okay, let's have a look. No, maybe. No. Okay, we're going to go back. I'm going to close that. Sorry, folks.
Just while
Let's
you're
try
looking,
again.
I've got a comment in the chat suggesting that those auctions sound a bit like the auction reality shows that we see from
Oh, yeah,
people bid on
that's
story
right.
flickers.
So what? Yeah, that's right. Story flockers. Yeah, exactly. So there ain't nothing new under the sun. You're right. They're exactly on that continuum. And anybody who's watched those shows, or I haven't watched them, even heard of them, knows about the excitement there is about them. And oh, here I am. And just that sense of what might there be, what might we find there.
So it's nothing new.
Oh, yeah,
if we had reality shows back then, they would have been doing the railway.
They did. I mean, so the newspaper coverage, which was extensive and very narrative. I mean, you know, they were making up stories about it. It was very much like watching reality TV. Reading these accounts would be familiar to anybody who knows those shows. The lady I'm talking about, who was the originator of opportunity shops, was Lady Millie Tallis, and she is. I know what's happening here. It's the dreaded hover mouse.
Oh.
The hover mouse. Oh, God damn it. Sorry, folks. The hover mouse is doing its evil thing again. Okay, I'm going to go back this way if I can. No, it's just not going to do it. I want to tell you about Millie Tallis. So I'm just going to talk about her. I'm going to stop share. I can tell you about her without the pictures, I reckon. Lady Millie Tallis was a society lady, and sorry, I still am trying to get it for you. I can't resist. Was a society lady who was on the fundraising committee for a new wing for St Vincent's Hospital in 1925. I'm not going to find it. Sorry, it just won't do it. So I'm coming back to you. So Lady Millie Tallis was on the fundraising committee, and she and her husband had just arrived back from a motoring tour of Europe and the US. And in both those places, now this is the mid-1920s, in both of these places, she had seen obviously charitable secondhand shops. And she had seen them in France going by the name Magasin d'Occasion, which, as I understand it, meant bargain shop, as she understood it too. But there's another potential translation of d'occasion, which is opportunity. So Lady Millie, she had a former career on the vaudeville stage, so she had that kind of leaning. And so she said, let's call it an opportunity shop, and let's use the building that's currently on the site planned for our new wing, our X-ray wing at St Vincent's. Let's use that building as the venue for an opportunity shop. Now, Melbourne had seen plenty of jumble sales before. Jumble sales were a thing since the early 1890s, and a hall would be hired and all sorts of things, as well as fresh produce and crafts and stuff would be put on sale. We all know what a jumble sale is now, but it was in the early 1890s that your secondhand year was added to it. So this, though, was almost entirely a secondhand sale, and they called on donations from all around Melbourne, not just all around Melbourne, but all around Victoria, to send stuff in. Victorian Railways came to the party and said, we'll carry the stuff for free. And there were receiving baskets on the platforms at Spencer Street and Flinders Street and Princess Bridge, where you could leave stuff as you got off the train. And these were cleared every day and taken gratis up to Fitzroy by the St Vincent's Hospital. And this building had formerly been a It was kind of a proto picture show, only it was with a revolving picture that would go around the outside of this, of the inside wall of the circular building, and the audience would be in the middle, and they'd be watching this thing go around. A cyclorama was what it was called, going around being the cycle. So it was a circular building. It was a real white elephant, because picture shows were now, of course, a big thing, and nobody wanted to go to a cyclorama. It had been a boxing gym for a while, and had been owned by John Wren, who had sold it as a bargain to being a charitable chap to St Vincent's Hospital for their new wing. So the first op shop was held there. And those photos that I was trying to show you were newspaper photos, very grainy, a bit like the one that I'm producing for you here. And you could just see these misty kind of objets in the background that really made you wish you could step into the picture, Mary Poppins style, and see what they actually have for sale. The one seemed to be motorbikes and wardrobes and singer sewing machines and old paintings and flags and God knows what. There were all kinds of things, and people donated so much stuff. And what made this different, what made it an opportunity shop and not a jumble sale, was that it didn't just last for an afternoon or a couple of days, as jumble sales did. It lasted for 3 months or more, from late 1925 through till 1926, and raised on its first day of opening more than £300 for St Vincent's Hospital. And that was a lot of money then. It was sort of like $20,000 or more. So it was a huge fundraiser, and played a big part, along with the footy matches and the beauty contests and the telephonist competitions. God knows what that was. Raised money for this wing, which I think still stands next to the oldest St Vincent's Hospital building at the corner of Nicholson Street. So that was the first op shop, and seeing the success of that, it was followed up by other charitable fundraisers, one the next year for the Children's Hospital, and in other states as well. We had them popping up in Adelaide and in Queensland and in Geelong. There was an op shop fairly early on, but they kind of petered out with the 1920s. It's kind of surprising. You would have thought they'd carry on through the Depression, but in fact, the only one that rose up and then continued on from the 1930s was the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. They were in that same part of Melbourne, a very poor working class area of Fitzroy. And the Brotherhood, a Methodist charity, I think it was originally, started a little opportunity shop in Gertrude Street. And it was so popular, as were similar things, sort of, they didn't go by the name op shop, but similar things in Sydney around the time of the Second World War. They were so popular that the police used to have to be there on opening days, which was only once or twice a month. They would be there to control the crowds. And it's a bit like now, to make sure no more than a certain number of people went in the shop at a time. So the op shop was incredibly popular. The interesting thing, I want to just go back to that St Vincent's op shop at the Cyclorama, was that it wasn't just popular with those people in the poorest areas, which was why it had been situated there in a way, but people came from all parts of Melbourne, and were encouraged to come from all parts of Melbourne to shop there, because the point was, as the point still is, and as the point has been from the very beginning with charitable salvage, as they called it in the earliest days, they want your money. The charities running these shops do not care who shops there. They want your money so that they can conduct their social programs and distribute the proceeds to the people who need it most. And this was the case with the Salvation Army, and of course still is. The Salvation Army was the originator of the charitable secondhand shops called salvage stores in London and other parts of England in the 1890s. And they made it very clear through their advertising and promotion that they wanted everyone to come there, and they wanted to, take over the secondhand industry to make money for their charity. And so it continued. It was the same with the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, and the Brotherhood continued on. They still have an op shop downstairs in the Royal Arcade in central Melbourne, and that's been there since if not the 30s, the 40s. I think it must be one of the longest running opportunity shops anywhere. In the US, there were the Goodwill stores, and they've certainly run since the early 20th century, but, you know, with ups and downs. But the Brotherhood shop and the Brotherhood as an op shop entity has been big time throughout much of the 20th century and into the 21st. They ran a really big, large scale and successful salvage business through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, where they would send out those paper bags that we always used to call rag bags that would arrive in your letterbox, and you'd fill them up with rags and either put them out on collection day or ring the Brotherhood and they'd come and collect them in a truck that would come out to the suburbs. Of course, in 1970, what was it, 6, I think, the first of the collection bins was installed at a service station in Glen Iris, I think, in Melbourne, and other service stations and supermarket car parks. And that changed the whole equation. So you didn't have to wait or ring and wait for somebody to come and collect it. You could take it there. It was completely anonymous, and they were game changers. So another thing that the Brotherhood did was that in the 1960s, 1965, I think, they opened a big opportunity shop in Brunswick Street, Fitzroy, which was still there right until the 2000s, I think. I knew it well when I worked in Brunswick Street in the 1980s, and it opened in 65, selling 3 things. It sold furniture, it sold books, and it sold fancy dress costumes or theatrical costumes. It was the Brotherhood's theatrical department. So they had another shop that sold commonplace gear somewhere else, but this one was the fancy dress one. And the sorts of things they had were old First World War military uniforms, flapper dresses, Edwardian evening wear, and that kind of thing. So this is the 1960s. They had the kind of gear that went back 30 or 40 years, 40 or 50 years even. And so my eyes water at the prospect of what must have been for sale there. But they were very much advertising it as fancy dress, or the sort of place you could shop for the costumes for your amateur theatricals or your school plays. And that was interesting because here was a real hinge time. 1965, 1966, the King's Road in Chelsea in London, the other side of the globe, the sort of vintage stores, I guess you'd call them, were taking off. And in the markets of in Portobello Road and so on, they were just taking off. And what changed this from being a really fringe thing to being a more mainstream thing, these old clothes as something you might wear on the street, was Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones making an appearance on a sort of countdown type show called Ready, Steady, Go in 1966. And Mick Jagger appeared in a crimson artilleryman's uniform from the First World War, which he bought in one of these vintage stores, these trend-setting vintage stores on the King's Road. And this was the game changer. Suddenly the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, you name it, were all in these kinds of uniforms, as was anybody else who wanted to be cool. But of course, the thing was, you weren't wearing them as fancy dress, you were wearing them as streetwear. You were probably wearing them barefoot. The girls were wearing the flapper gear, but again, they'd sort of had, you know, the flowers in the hair, who knows what. But it was quite a different look. It was quite a different appropriation of those original fashions. So that Brotherhood store in Melbourne was fancy dress, and then suddenly everybody must have piled on for the vintage gear, which became mainstream from the mid-60s onwards. And I mention in the book that the manager of that big store in Brunswick Street was a Mrs. Jones. She was the mother of Barry Jones, who at that time, of course, was the quiz king on Pick a Box, and went on to be a well-known public intellectual and politician, of course, of some renown. And I didn't know Mrs. Jones's name, but I have been contacted by her family and have come to know her well, I feel, as Ruth. And I was so pleased to know her name, because knowing her name and seeing her there in that store full of full of uniforms and bookcases and knickknacks and books. I just felt like I could see how she belonged there then. So that was kind of the op shop story as I told it in the PowerPoint, which you regrettably have missed out on. Now I know we have a bit of time for questions and so on. I know Stuart has told me that people have been remarking on the storage wars type shows that rival the. I'm just looking at something down here. I want to show you some of my things that I've found lately in op shops. Now, let's say lately, obviously not in COVID-19 times. Let me show you my mint green Mixmaster, which really complements. I'm just going to, if I can just grapple the two, really complements the cover of my book. See how they fit together? So that was a great find and goes really well in the sandpit as well for the grandchildren.
Well planned. One of the things in the chat was, can you please show us all the cool stuff you've got behind you, basically?
Here, look at this. I found this in the 50-cent basket outside one of our local op shops a couple of months ago. It's one of a pair. I didn't buy a single shoe, but it's a bottle green suede pair of 10-pin bowling shoes, which are so cool. They've got suede also on the soles, of course. But the problem is, and I can't actually illustrate this because it only does it when I walk in, they are the squeakiest shoes I have ever had on my feet. So I can see how I thought they were such a bargain. I still think that, but I can see why they ended up there, because I suspect they're going to be shoes that I'll never be able to wear because they're so darn noisy, but they are gorgeous. And I have this, this is a Polaroid camera money box. Look at this. How cool is that I found fairly recently, which I really like. You can get money out at the bottom, but you can't see that. But it says here, have a nice day. And I do like that. It's so lifelike. I feel like I could take a snap with that. And the other stuff, I mean, it's just lots of, clothes and tassels and rick-a-rack and, this great bag was given me.
My wife actually handed me a note under the table saying, I want Robyn's bag.
Well, this bag was given me by Heather, who was my conversation partner at the last live event I did in February at Croydon. It was an event run by Collins Bookshop in Croydon, but it was held in the Salvo's store. It was fabulous. There were about 85 or 90 people there. And Heather brought along and gifted to me this fabulous leather bag of many tongues. It's, hang on, I've got to tell you, it's made by...
Bag of many tongues.
It's made by Olga Berg, which apparently makes it a good bag. I know nothing of this, but it's a beautiful thing. I can tell you it's only about big enough to hold a passport and not much else. Probably, a lipstick and some concealer or whatever that is, but it's a lovely thing. And I mean, I have a Lurex jacket here. I do love anything that's Lurex, just because. And this Betty Grable tie.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's about, I don't really appreciate it, but it's about 6 inches wide and would date from the 70s. It's sort of screen printed, as you can see.
We were joking before the stream that I should have worn a tie for the thing. I would have worn that tie.
You could have worn this. This would be the one. If you have to wear a tie, that's definitely the one. But basically, behind me, I have lots of just, stuff I love to keep. And I talk about curating as if it's a bad thing, but I do feel like I curate lots. I'll find it in a secondhand shop and think, I've just got to take this home and look after it because somebody else might not. And my real weak point is probably overcoats. I have so many overcoats and I need to live in a much colder climate. I mean, it does get cold in central Victoria, but not really cold enough to do justice to the number of overcoats that I possess. But I do my best.
Well,
and every one of them has a hanky
because I've got a million overcoats back there. So I'm the same.
Every one of these has a hanky in the pocket, again, which I get from op shops. They're fabulous. Somebody else is saying there are things that some people won't buy from op shops: shoes, handkerchiefs, false teeth. I will buy all those things.
Even the false teeth?
I do have false teeth because they should never be in op shops, of course. And people tell me terrible stories about how they end up there. Basically, a family will just come and empty everything into the op shop, from people's bedside drawers and so on when someone passes away, and that they don't take the trouble to throw out the false teeth. Just appalls me. So I bring them home and look after them.
Somebody should. Now, I do have a question in the chat from Jess, I think. How do you think the fact that op shopping is so fashionable now has influenced op shop culture and business and prices?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because people
And
talk about
aprons.
this. Hey?
And aprons.
Oh, and aprons. Okay, well, that's a different thing.
That may be part of a different question.
I don't know. I mean, I live, in Castlemaine, we have, when they're up and running, we have 5 op shops, and they range from very traditional budget, get everything out of here op shops to high end. And so I see the whole span, but there's more stuff being chucked out or given to op shops than ever before. So I cannot understand why I know it's a supply and demand situation, but I can't understand why they're putting high prices on things. I know they can say we can get high prices for them, but you want to keep the stuff going. I think people who live in the city have a really different experience from what we have in the country. I think they do have op shops that can afford to put high prices on things and know that they'll get them. But yeah, it's a bit deplorable. And I'm a volunteer at the Salvation Army op shop here, and they recently moved premises, but were determined to keep it kind of a bit grungy and to keep prices down and to keep it feeling more like a warehouse than a store. And I really like that because that's very much in the spirit of the traditional original Salvo stores, but of op shops as I have known and loved them. So, I'm really sorry about that, about op shops taking a turn for the upmarket, but we only have ourselves to blame because we frequent them and we'll pay the prices.
And 1960s rockers, we've got them to blame too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Let's blame Mick Jagger. Why not? He should be blamed for something. and aprons, I've collected aprons for, I don't know, long time, and I don't collect them with the vigor that I once did. But anybody who looks at vintage aprons knows that some of the best vintage fabric you can still find is in aprons, because the dresses of that sort, the dresses in the old 1950s and 1960s lovely cottons, were just worn to death. They were just house dresses for people, but the aprons somehow. People had enough aprons that they shared the wear across them, and some of those aprons have survived, and the beautiful fabrics in them. So yeah, I'm an appreciator of aprons generally, especially if they have big pockets.
Excellent. Now I'll just give the chat maybe another couple of seconds to answer some questions. Otherwise, we might to ask some questions. Otherwise, we might
can answer them.
We might wrap up in a couple of minutes. Otherwise,
all right.
Was there anything you wanted to cover that you haven't had a chance to?
Oh yeah, millions of things. But...
Of course. You wrote a book about it. You actually could go for quite some time.
Yeah, look,
on
the book covers way too many things. I mean, so many more things than I expected it to. And so much of it, of course, feeds into the current conversation about recycling and reuse. I didn't really touch upon, or barely touched upon, how things were recycled up until comparatively recent times, in that period in which there was no such thing as waste. And the things that haven't survived, those cotton and woolen garments from the 19th century, that, as I say, there's mainly silk as representatives of that era's fashions. Those things didn't survive because they were sold and resold and resold and resold until they became ground up with some new wool and made into an inferior but cheap fabric, which clothes were widely made of from the 19th century onwards. So none of those things have survived for us to see, because and of course, when they got beyond anything, when they could no longer be used for anything, they were made into manure. They called them land rags and spread them on the fields as manure for things to grow in. So everything was used down to its last essence, basically. Wow. And that is such a popular idea now, but such an unattainable one, because we don't need to do that anymore. We don't think we do.
And I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking you've kind of done the same thing with history for this. You've gone around and you've picked up all the little secondhand bits of information and recycled them into something new and interesting and fun to read. So
yeah,
you're carrying on the tradition.
And it's partly, of course, I draw largely on newspaper references and newspaper conversations that were going on, which was, how information was so largely disseminated in earlier times. And I recycle a lot of that thanks to Trove newspapers. It's so accessible now. And, it does keep something that was thought of as ephemeral, newspapers. It circulates them, puts them back in circulation by drawing on what was in those things. People, I'm sure at the time, just imagined they were thrown away afterwards. And to think that those things live on to inform new research and new conversations now is just, the ultimate in recycling as far as I'm concerned.
I do have one last question from the chat. That considering it seems like we're drowning in stuff in this day and age, are op shops also drowning in discarded stuff?
Oh, they are. They are. I shudder to think what is going to happen when op shops start taking donations again after this time of closure, of shutdown. Because, what's happening to the stuff? What are people doing with stuff in the meantime? We've probably all noticed people putting out their own stuff on nature strips increasingly. At least I've noticed it. Stuff that would normally go to the op shop is being put out the front for people to browse and take away. But as I said, I'm a volunteer in our local salvos, and the amount of stuff that is heaped onto them and completely without thought or without editing by the people who are chucking it out. It's just, we don't want to pay tip fees. Our bin is full. You can have the lot. And it's just overwhelming. I mean, it's true, the salvos make some great money from that secondhand stuff, but the amount of money they spend on waste and tip fees is huge. One thing I'm really grateful about, and I think the government and government authorities and councils should be grateful too, is how much tipping of stuff in the bush, in creeks, along country roads does not happen the way it happened not that many years ago, because op shops are there to fill the gap. I suspect we'll probably see more of that in the short term with op shops not taking donations. But, the op shops are overwhelmed, and I'd love to see governments recognise the role that they play in waste management as a really key part in the waste management structure. I don't think they do. They don't get much support at all, and they're just vital, and I think overlooked in that way. So they are overwhelmed. It's to their benefit in some ways, but they're run by volunteers, usually older volunteers, and I'm just sick of seeing old ladies staggering around with heavy bits of furniture and stuff. It breaks my heart, and it breaks my back sometimes too, because I am one of those old ladies.
Yes, well, thank you very much for all of that, Robyn. That was a great test of...
Thank you, Stuart, for letting me be the guinea pig.
Thank you for being our guinea pig. You're definitely the nicest and most helpful guinea pig that we could have asked for.
And of course, our audience are guinea pigs as well.
Yes,
thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for adding some things into the chat and jumping in and watching along. I will remind you one more time that nothing new is available for order through any of your local bookstores. Most of them are taking online orders. To check out our website for all of the cool things that you can do online, even if the library isn't physically open. And remind you that basically at the same time next week, we'll be talking to Adam Courtney about his new book, The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter. Oh, you picked the right side first. That was one. So Adam and I will be talking about his new book, which I have just received, and we'll try and read before then and have some great questions for him.
You can do it, Stuart.
I probably will.
Just don't sleep.
I've flicked through it very quickly. It actually looks really great. So, but thank you once again, Robyn. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And thank you for making it through all of this with us.
Thanks,
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.